Hello, this is the unit on education, where we will focus on global forces, unprecedented challenges, usual responses, and enduring problematic imaginaries in education. And I'm using the word imaginaries here as a noun to mean the social container or containers for what is considered real, ideal, sensible, desirable, and intelligible in societies or social groups. And I'm starting here with a reminder that if the content of this course opens cans of worms for you, this is part of the learning process, and I would like to invite you to sit with that difficulty and that discomfort and try to transform responses of defensiveness, confusion, and anxiety into pause, humility, and disarmament. So, as we talk about education, it's important to contextualize it in contemporary times. So it's impossible to talk today about education without talking about globalization. And here in this slide, it's just an overview and summary of globalization as an intensification of migration, interconnectivity, cultural hybridity, ecological vulnerability, and reconfigurations of economic and political power driven by global financial capital. Here we're talking about austerity, wealth concentration, surplus labor, and the shift of the role of the state. Of course, also involving intensified conflicts, some of them violent conflicts. So we're going to be talking more about global change in another unit, but it's important to start, when we talk about education, to start with the context in order to understand the unprecedented challenges we're facing as educators. And these challenges involve social fragmentation, information bubbles and echo chambers, uncertain futurity, political mistrust, projected blame, volatility, and what some people are calling pre-traumatic stress response. So that's the increase of incidents of anxiety, depression, and self-harm amongst young people as a response to this a mismatch between the promises of the future they have been made or that the previous generations have realized or are still making, and the realization that these promises are either broken or are unrealistic. And then our challenge to provide other possibilities for the construction of the future. So this is all related to what we're talking about in global education and global citizenship education. And the presentation today will try to give you a synthesis of these questions and issues that we're trying to address. So here again, in synthesis, societies are indeed changing. The change is happening at a much faster pace than it has ever happened before. Students will face more complexity, uncertainty, diversity, instability, volatility, and inequality than we have faced in our lifetime. And the traditional model of schooling no longer holds currency for society or for the market. And this is something to pay attention to. Now, when we think about the responses from the field of education to these challenges, there are three types. The first response is that we need more technology to prepare students for the future, or we need more individualized learning, or we need more internationalization, or we need the three things to try to guarantee access to social mobility for our students. So in that sense, there is an ongoing deprofessionalization of the teaching profession, where simple solutions are offered for wicked problems, for problems that are much more complex than what they are being than the way they are being presented. And there's a shift of the ideal of the outcome of education from university graduates to digital global entrepreneurs or freelance celebrities. So I've been to several conferences on education, especially for principals, selling the idea that university is no longer necessary, which I'm not actually, this is a separate issue for us to talk about. I think there are arguments there that are valid, but then the horizon should be related to creating these entrepreneurs that will access different kinds of markets and accumulate wealth in a knowledge society in a very new way. So the idea that life is about accumulation and mobility is not challenged, and we can see other horizons of hope for the students being presented in education, and I think that is a huge problem. So in terms of our role as educators and the role of education in society, it's important to ask, what's education's role? Is it to adapt to change or to shape change? And what else is possible for us to imagine? How do we get, as a profession, to the edge of our current imaginary? So remember, imaginary being the container for what we feel is possible, and for where we set our horizon of hope. How do we expand that in our own education? How do we see education, our own education of practitioners, as an expansion of possibilities, of sensibilities, of futurities that can give our students other horizons of hope, not the same ones? So here, just a suggestion, if you want to take a step back and calibrate this discussion about individualized learning and technology, I think these two books in education are really, really important. One is Alone Together by Sherry Turkle, that talks about the promises of technology and the false promises of technology, and also Beyond Learning, of Gert Besta. And he also has an article called Robot Vacuum Cleaners he talks about the problems with these hyper individualization of learning and the transformation of learners into consumers of knowledge. And I think these two books, if you're interested, can help understand the critique much further, or take the discussions much further. And in terms of global citizenship education, everything that I've presented so far gets translated into discussions as the need for internationalization and diversity here, like our schools and institutions need to internationalize, and we need to cater for our diversity here. So I have seen global citizenship education being used with that connotation. The second narrative that I have encountered is that global citizenship education is about globalization and global justice. The third one talks about alternative frames and futures, and this agenda is related to the agenda for sustainability and for global change. And the fourth narrative is about building ethical relationships with communities locally and globally in the context of inequalities. So depending on where your school or institution, or where yourself, where you're coming from, you will have probably encountered one of the four. And it's important to notice that they are different, right? That people come to the idea of global citizenship education from very different trajectories. And today we're not going to talk about any one of this. We're going to talk about a bigger problem, which is what I call an enduring problematic imaginary that we have in education that cuts across all four narratives. Apart from the fourth one, actually, it's uninterrupted in the fourth one. So I generally ask people that are coming to this work for the first time to imagine a field of corn, and to harvest the corn and place them in front of them very quickly. And then I ask them to compare the corn they have in front of them to this image that was taken in Peru of multicolored corn cob. And I used this image to talk about the colonization of our imagination by yellow corn cobs, because that's probably, I don't know if that's what you imagine, but if you have only been exposed to yellow corn cobs, that's probably what you're gonna imagine. And there is an economic and political reason why the yellow corn cob has become the variety that we're used to. But today we're going to use it as a metaphor or as a figuration for the normalization and naturalization of a single story of progress, development, and human evolution. So this story determines what we will see as sensible and desirable in terms of schooling, in terms of clothing, in terms of relationships, faith and religion, in terms of justice, security, and institutions, right? Social contracts. And the yellow corn cob in itself is not a problem. It's a variety of corn cob. The problem is when it becomes the only corn cob that we're exposed to. And it creates a situation where there is an abyss. And this is Boaventura de Souza Santos, a sociologist that talks about abyssal thinking. Our thinking becomes an abyss. And what is on the plateau are things that we see as valuable, real, and ideal. And beyond that, beyond the yellow corn cob at the top of this abyss, there is nothing. There's nothing valuable. And for things to become valuable, they need to be brought up to the plateau and be painted yellow and become intelligible to our imaginary, right? So this is very important because it doesn't talk about what we don't imagine as an extension of our imagination or of our knowledge, but what we cannot imagine, precisely because this yellow corn cob has this principle of universalization, that it is all-encompassing and that it should become everything that we know. Right? So by believing in the universality of the yellow corn cob, we actually close down the possibilities for us to even be able to perceive, to fathom different possibilities. In this limitation of the imagination to fathom even other possibilities because of an investment in the universality of the yellow corn cob is the enduring problematic thing that we have in global citizenship and in our challenges of sustainability. How can we imagine other futures, other possibilities for a relationship, other possibilities of being in the world if we are still invested at a very sometimes unconscious level in the universality and the securities of one way of being? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but first I'm going to use an example that comes from England of the Mori School Omnibus Survey conducted by DFID until 2007. They conducted it for 11 years. And this was the only question about interdependence that was there in the survey. How can poorer countries affect us in the UK? And these were the options that people had to choose from, right? By getting us involved in their conflicts, by increasing risks of diseases spreading in the UK, by increasing the number of people wanting to live here, by affecting our jobs and our economy, by damaging the Earth's environment, and the sixth one, which is my favorite, by making our foreign holidays more dangerous. So this idea that the other is only there as a threat or where these other contexts are just an extension of our entitlements to go and have, say, foreign holidays, is something that is enduring, that it's very difficult to challenge. This is not just a challenge of information. This is not happening because people are lacking the information. It's not a problem of ignorance. It's a problem of a habit of being. And this, if it's not necessarily only changed with more knowledge, it's changed with experiences and practices. So education here, the educational challenge is interesting because just challenging the worldview might not lead to a change of behavior. So again, empirically, we have evidence that this imaginary that is shown in the survey might have improved here and there in terms of information, but still the habit of separating the yellow corn cob and the multicolored corn cob and associating the yellow corn cob with intelligence, benevolence, deservedness, cleanness, capacity, and leadership, and as opposed to lack, inadequacy, ignorance, violence, helplessness, servitude, and waste, that it's still there, and it's going to be there for a long time, because the challenge is not related to an informational problem. It's related to much deeper structures and systems that create this as an effect. This is a symptom of another deeper problem, right? So part of my work has been to try to name the problem, right? Name the symptoms, and so that we can see the symptoms as we're working with global citizenship education. And the heads up checklist, which was what it was called in the beginning, I call it tool now, is one of the ways that we have just to identify the problem. But what I would like to invite you to do with the list is not to see that as a checklist of things that you don't want to do, but as an invitation to embark on a difficult journey that is long-term, lifelong, life-wide, of interrupting certain patterns that are not only cognitive, but they're existential. So the first pattern between the yellow corn cob and the multicolored corn cob is hegemony. So the idea that when the yellow corn cob wants to relate to or to help the multicolored corn cob, it tends to reinforce or justify the status quo. It tends to operate on the universality of the yellow corn cob and to paint the other corn cobs yellow. It's also ethnocentric, which is a related pattern where one view is projected as universal. So one view of relationships, of justice, of everything is there's only one single story that is projected as universal. That's what sometimes, or most times, justifies the interventions. It's also ahistorical. The pattern of ahistoricism is where we relate to, for example, when we have school links between the UK and other countries in Africa, we forget historical legacies and complicities. It's also depoliticized, where we disregard power inequalities and ideologies. It tends to be salvationist and self-serving, invested in self-congratulatory heroism, and uncomplicated, offering feel-good quick fixes, and paternalistic, waiting for a thank you at the end of the relationship or the intervention. So it kind of, it's still based on investments in virtue or in heroism or protagonism or agency for the yellow corn cob, in ways that may still benefit in some ways the multicolored corn cobs. I'm not saying that there are no benefits there, but educationally, in the long term, we are still reproducing this division, right? And just elevating the yellow corn cobs together with the multicolored corn cobs and the yellow corn cobs is actually just glossing over the deeper structures that maintain these divisions as well. So it's not just a matter of treating people better. It is this situation is a result of structural, systemic, historical inequalities that cannot be solved overnight, right? And cannot be solved just with a change of perspective. But changes of perspective do other things. They don't solve the problem, but they can help us move together towards different horizons, right? So here I'm going to finish today with just a few questions that that shifts of perspective can help us hold. And the first question is, how can we see the people who have been systemically and historically marginalized, or the other, as equally intelligent, equally capable, equally knowledgeable, equally deserving, equally contradictory, and equally complex, right? So we cannot essentialize who this other person is. And what's interesting is that the yellow corn cob, because of its own universalization, it will want to see other corn cobs as either pink or purple or blue, but the yellow corn cob itself is complex and contradictory. It's just the image of yellowness that gets projected outwards that is coherent. So part of the issue here is, how do we see ourselves first as complex, contradictory, knowledgeable and capable, but also ignorant of so many things? How do we meet each other in a more humble space, right, where we're not so invested in our sense of coherence or worth even, right? So how do we find a space of intrinsic worth within us where we can meet each other in a very different way? How do we learn from histories of trauma and ongoing harm without guilt, paralysis, quick fixes, or pessimism? So that's another one for us to sit with, right? So if our students are facing all this negative information coming, which probably comes from things that are not going well in the world too, right? We don't want to shelter them from this. We don't want to leave them unprepared to deal with it either. So we need to learn ourselves first how to sit with all the pain, right? The collective pain that we have as humanity, and with all its contradictions and the potential for so much harm and so much good. So I'm not advocating here the idea of seeing humanity as only this benevolent good thing and seeing what is not that which we want as inhuman. I'm advocating here as facing humanity in all its complexity and potential for horrible things and for wonderful things. So how do we shift that, again, from black and white to a much more complex picture of ourselves, of others, and of our histories? How can we see the limits of the knowledge we consider universal and unlimited? And not only see the limits, but disinvest in this universality. So this universality is what makes us want knowledge to explain everything, like as if they were bricks one on top of the other, and then we'll get to build a wall or something or a box that will be enough to put the world in, right? Will be big enough. We can't put the world in a box. The world, number one, keeps changing. Number two, it's too big. So how do we then face this world that is big and changing without overcoding it or without the desire for a kind of knowledge or a definition of something to be able to keep it in place, right? And organize things and create policies that everybody will understand in the same way, and then our behaviors will change and we'll have everything under control. This is a fantasy, right? So if that is a fantasy, how do we meet the world in all its complexity and indeterminacy and uncertainty from a different habit of being, from a different way of living with the world, with ourselves, and with each other? And the last one is, how can we reignite our visceral sense of connectedness with and responsibility towards each other and the planet? And here my question is, how do we do that beyond notions of national identity and beyond notions of that are sustained by global capital? So how do we relate beyond our consumer identities and our national identities? What else? What else interweaves us into each other, right? And how do we become sensitive to to being part of a wider metabolism that encompasses the whole planet and maybe the whole universe, and where we take responsibility for everything, but not as an act of intellectual choice, as just a visceral act of relationship, right? Of being responsible for our bodies beyond the body that we have right now, right? So this is the kind of inquiry that I'm inviting you to experiment with, and I hope we can talk more about that during the tutorial. I'll see you there.